Good evening, ladies and gents. We're live on air. Live on air, ladies and gents. It's the peasant. It's the prodigious. It's the prominent professor at Proclamation News and Gavin's. We're joining the union, part of the aristocracy social elite. We're on the module DD 103. Let's look at my academic integrity. Some of the key skills that I've learnt. Like philosophy, critical thinking. I mean, you've been on my show for a few days, some of you. Been on my show for a few days, and we're outlining everything global that's causing a provocation across the globe. Globalization. What runs the world? Some people say globalization. What about the ozone layer? We're talking about global warming. Ozone layer is one of the. Without, if the ozone layer takes over the Earth, that's it. That's the end of the Earth. So we are basically governed by not this absolute sovereignty of the land. Everyone goes, politicians run all the money, politicians run the land. No, look at what footballers get, look what actors get. But money is a big part, like globalisation. Globalisation, absolutely. My phone thing, sorry about that. But the ozone layer is another thing. About it, the ozone layer, eco-friendly. Let's just ask my mother. Sorry about that, guys. I'll have to ring her back in a minute. I won't answer that now. I'll put that on silent. Sorry about that. Yeah. Anyway, moving on. Well, my academic integrity, my year studying. We're on the module DD 103, investigating the social world too. Some people say, why am I reading it online? Why am I reading it on my radio? Because when I read, it's like anything, we can read journalism. When we read journalism, we can depict where things are going wrong in the world, like anexphobia. We can tackle hate crime. We can tackle sociological society that's brought up in the urban surrounding where there's criminology, everything else. Anyway, on this next not next module, next chapter, Governing Common Resources by Daniel Conway and Edward Westmisnter. Looking at the introduction on page 73. In this chapter, you will consider how international political boundaries have created patterns of cooperation and conflict in seeking to manage, exploit and protect shared or common resources such as water. These common resources can also be the focus for political disputes between states over rights of ownership, regulation, and access, and ultimately a source of diplomatic and military conflict. After this next paragraph, I want to point something out, something there if we'd caught my eye and I thought of something well, but recently studied. This chapter will explore how common resources have come to play a major role in contemporary global politics and how disputes over them relate to wider power struggles. Think of all the governed, like Parliament, you've got Castel Koch, you've got the White House in America. Think what they're all overlooking. I'm not sure what their White House is overlooking because I don't really look at the geography of the White House. It doesn't really relate to us because I'm in the United Kingdom. But I know a lot of people in the US it will relate to. They live in the US, so it will relate to them. But Castel Koch, the United Kingdom. Obviously, I've studied it, so I looked at the surroundings. I noticed two things in that first paragraph. We're talking about the contemporary global politics, the common resources around Parliament, common resources around Castel Koch. Like I said before, talking about globalisation. Castel Koch itself is part of the globalisation industry that kept it running. It had a grapevine on the back that produced wine. So it had a lot of money that was getting pumped through that building itself. That's without the political um, debates and everything else that went on in there. Let's look at, where was it? Such as water. You've got Welsh Valley. The Welsh Valley that runs right through Castell Cosh. The Welsh Valley, where the minerals get, as well, the water comes from in the Castell Cosh. So, that's like a multi-billion pound project just without the politics inside. All the distributions get run through outside Castell Cosh. Anyway, in this chapter, we'll explore global common resources and resource domains. Governance regimes as an international means of defining, organising and regulating global common resources. Sovereignty as a key principle in international relations and how the principle has changed and is being challenged in contemporary international affairs. We're going to look at this section 1 now. Oceans and seas as a common resource provides an overview of the concept of common resources from an international relations perspective, particularly in relation to the concept of sovereignty. In the section 2, we've got the governance and regimes. Looks at the formation of regimes to govern shared resources. Section 3, common resource and state sovereignty outlines the concept of sovereignty. Briefly explores how it came into being and considers whether the duty to protect the commons undermines it. Section 4, case study 1, hydro politics explores water resources in that area. Section 5, case 2 study, South and East China Seas, look at a contested territory of the sea in East Asia where China has sought to lay claim to territory. Page 74. Oceans and seas as a common resource. Since the 17th century, the basic principle of the modern international system has been sovereign ownership of territory, coastal waters, and more recently, airspace by states. As Chapter 1 has explained, global common resource refers to a type of resource that lies outside the political reach of any one nation state and therefore could be accessed by any nation state. So any and of any one nation state it can therefore be accessed by any nation state. The picture is further complicated by changing and shifting political circumstances, which mean that the boundary between the nation states and particularly resource domains is not a fixed one. In practice, common resources can be international and shared by several nations. The Mediterranean Sea is an example of this. The states surrounding the Mediterranean seas are all legally entitled to claim sovereignty over the sea surrounding their borders. An example of the tension that can rise over maritime access, one that fortunately had not resulted in armed conflict. It is the dispute between the United Kingdom and Spain over control and access to Gibraltar and its surrounding waters. On a number of occasions, the UK Foreign Office has taken a serious diplomatic step in summoning the Spanish ambassador to protest and warn against the redirection of Spanish naval ships across what the British government considers to be its territorial waters surrounding Gibraltar. At the tip of the Iberian Peninsula. On one such occasion in 2014, the Spanish government has quickly responded by summoning the British ambassador in Madrid and expressed its deep unease at the unacceptable interference by the United Kingdom in the routine activities of the Spanish Navy in Spanish waters. Merco Press 2014. Spain disputes Britain's sovereignty over Gibraltar and considers the waters surrounding it to be Spanish territory. This may seem like a curious series of events to have taken place in 21st century between two allies and members of the European Union, but it was characteristic of the diplomatic dispute between the UK and Spain. That the dispute focuses on the sea reflects a much broader trend in international politics. Disputes over access, ownership and the regulation and common resources in the world, including high seas, have increasingly come to force in recent decades. When the UK was ceded the territory of Gibraltar in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, ownership of the surrounding waters was not considered relevant. However, by the later half of the 20th century, international community have defined by the United Nations have access to the ownership of the sea should be regulated. However, this hasn't removed the possibility of conflict between states over common resources, particularly if there are broader economic, political, or environmental concerns to play in recent years. The UK has sought to restrict Spanish fishing rights, especially now as well, isn't it? Now we've gone with the Brexit. Citing the need to protect the scarce fish resources, and Spanish fishermen have protested in response, claiming it is in what they consider to be their territory. I mean, I don't know if you guys remember the Battle of the Morada. The Battle of the Morada, when we had Elizabeth I. She helped us defeat the Spanish fleet, pushed them up the Great Norman, is it Normandy Sea. So if you look that up, Elizabeth I, the Battle of the Morada. You see, I'm talking absolute sense. Specific disputes have also focused on the right of Gibraltar to sink an artificial reef to protect wildlife without Spanish permission, and on the ownership of the sunken treasure on ships wrecked in the waters surrounding Gibraltar. Those involved have used traditional state, sabre, rattling techniques ranging from formal diplomatic complaints to sending naval vessels. Both sides have also involved in international bodies to help resolve these disputes, including the European Union, the United Nations, or the European Court of Justice and courts in the United States. So, like, it's good, isn't it? I mean, when we do the research, I mean, I've done, obviously, this is my second year of study. So, when I started studying Book of Traditions, Book of Reputations, you get all further knowledge that helps implement it into a lot of stuff today. Because you need to look at the root of the problem. Talking about, like, what's going on with Spain trying to take our fish in our seas. Why do they think it's their sea? We've got the North Sea, haven't we? So why do they think it's part of their sea? Because they're not far off our border. What is their territory? What is ours? Look at the root of the problem. Back to the Marada. They've always tried to come and even invade our land as well. Bottom of page 75. Spanish fishermen staged a protest in disputed waters near the artificial reef Gibraltar in August 2013. In this area of the Mediterranean, two states claimed sovereignty and tried to restrict each other from gaining access. While common resources can be beyond sovereignty state jurisdiction throughout the 20th century. Which is, we're looking this somewhat why a lot of wars can go on because of this. Page 76. States have increasingly sought to claim sovereignty over areas of global common resources as demand for resource has grown and new technologies have enabled their exploitation. Global common resources include resources such as the oceans, the atmosphere, forests and rivers, which have historically been guided by the principle of belonging to the common heritage of humankind. Global common resources became more of a challenge for the international community, including states and international organizations in the 20th century. This is because technology developments now allow the states to reach both new resources, such as deep sea drilling to access oil and gas. And new areas such as air and outer space at the same time advance in scientific understandings have increased international concern about the environment and potential consequences should the use of the resources not be managed appropriately, as discussed in Chapter 2. Consider the examples of global common resource discussed so far. Can you think of common resource in your local area? Who has access to these commons and who regulates them? Are they are there any controversies or debates about them? In this discussion, you may have thought of places such as parks, communal land, lakes or rivers. Or perhaps you thought of community resources that are shared, such as leisure centres, car parks or allotments. Unlike global common resources, these are likely to be areas that are easier to access and may automatically fall under the authority of the state. Even so, there may be debate about who should have the rights of access and how best to regulate these areas. These debates could be focused on environmental concerns, property rights, economic efficiency, and social justice. For example, property developers may wish to build on parkland and greenland sites. Global common resources face many of the same pressures and debates, with the added complication of either lying outside state control or being subject to contestation between different states over the rights of access and ownership. Page 77. A cannon at St Kitts, West Indies, 3 miles offshore, was considered to be state territory because it was average distance and cannon could fire. The oldest recognised commons were the oceans, or more correctly, the high seas. For centuries, they were defined as being outside 3 mile limit of the territorial sea, which came under state jurisdiction, Vulgar 2000. The reason for this is that 3 miles was the range of the cannon shot. Beyond this limit, it is accepted, but the high seas were open to all for the purposes of navigation, fishing, and more recently, the laying of cables and aviation. However, once offshore oil exploration and factory fishing became technically feasible, the status of high sea as a common resource started to be challenged. Nation states begin to press for sovereign economic rights over coastal fisheries and continental shelves. The, the mining of the seabed also became a technical and economical possibility. In a landmark speech delivered to the UN General Assembly in 1967, Arvid Pardo, the Foreign Minister of Malta, suggested that the deep seabed should not be treated as beyond the remit of ownership, but should come under communal international management or governance as a common heritage of mankind, Vulgar 2000. The sea's resources should be shared along the international community and at equitable basis. This call, along with the pressure from other countries to enclose and define the substantial areas of the high seas, led to running attempt to reform the status of the oceans. Common resources, the third United Nations Conference on the Law of the Seas, which occurred between 1973 and 1982. In the late 20th and 21st centuries, there have been negotiations and agreements focusing on specific resources in the in the oceans, such as whales, fish stocks, and exploitation of minerals. Many of the conflicts and disputes about how these resources should be regulated focus on the rights of states to access resources. There is great concern that global common resources are approaching or are in a crisis. The influential metaphor of the tragedy of the commons highlights humanity relentless to desire the exploit of the world's resources which it left unchecked, could lead to their complete exhaustion and global crisis. However, there has been concern throughout history about the consequences of over exploitation and ultimate exhaustion of the world's finest resources. According to Harding, common resources should not be considered as freely available to all, but regulating and certain activities restricted to prevent catastrophe. Looking at summary, global common resources refers to resources that lie outside the political reach of any one nation state and are open to access by a number of nation states. Conflict can occur between nation states over ownership of common resources, such as between Spain and UK over the waters surrounding Gibraltar. The tragedy of the commons refers to the view that, left unregulated, common resource will quickly become exhausted. The late 20th century saw increasing regulation of problem commons by international organisations. Governments and regimes, page 79. There is an ongoing debate about the extent to which the common resources are in crisis. If you accept there is a crisis, the solution to the tragedy of commons is potentially provided by the state or the international community of the states acting in cooperation. For example, when problems of pollution or land use are essentially local, they can be dealt with by the state under those jurisdictions they fall. Governments can, in principle, take control and act in the common interest. They can enforce taxes on emissions, for example, or prohibit damaging environmental activities, and penalise those who transgress environmental rules. However, common resources do not fall under the jurisdiction of any one state, and it isn't a world government to effectively manage resources in the way a nation state can. However, although there is not a world agreement, it is possible for there to be an international governance regime. We're talking about pollution. Do you reckon one day we're going to get charged? I mean, it's down to the inhumane, if you like, the inhumane to cause pollution to society. You got a car, he's got a business. Pollution, causing pollution. So you reckon one day they're going to tax you for breathing CO2? CO2? One day, do you think they're going to make you pay for breathing oxygen? One day you'll get taxed for breathing oxygen, I believe, because it's the people who are inhumane driving cars going up from A to B. Do you really need to go from A to B all the time? Obviously, to do your work. But I mean, a lot of people waste a journey just for the sake of wasting a journey. One day they're going to charge you, I believe. The 1982 United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, is an example of how the international community, albeit not all states, agreed to a governance regime for the oceans. The UNCLOS provides an international legal framework that defines and regulates state territorial waters as well as states. Access to resources in the seas. As you can see in the figure 3.3, the UNCLOS defines different zones where states have sovereignty and the point at which the sea becomes a commons. With no sovereignty rights, the regulations include both the sea as an expanse of the water and the seabed beneath it. The UNCLOS does allow for states to request extensions of sovereignty beyond the standard 200 miles from the coastline. Should there be a reason, such as the discovery of large oil and other mineral resources, for example, there is a formal process by which states can apply to obtain approval on this via the UN, and there is a permanent court of arbitration based at The Hague to deal with disputes between states. Regulations designed to clarify the governance of airspace are also in use and is in context of international treaties define a state's sovereign airspace as 60,000 feet above the geographic boundaries and above 12 miles of sea from its coastline. Looking at figure 3, we've got the continental shelf. Sovereign rights for exploring the exploitation non-living resources of seabed and subsoil plus sedentary species. Potential claimable. The area of common heritage of mankind is 350 metres long. Exclusive economic zone. Sovereign rights for exploring, exploiting, conserving, and managing living and non-living resources of the water, seabed, and subsoil in the high seas. 200 metres long. Page 80. Here we go. The process that governs follow in making of national policy about regulating resources are complex and adding an international dimension. It complicates process further. The formation of international governance regimes for common resources can be affected by national and therefore internal. The concerns, for example, scientific information such as the environmental impacts of regulating governmental organisations at both national and international levels, businesses, trade and environmental groups often compete for influence over government policy, treaty ratification by parliaments, and effective compliance following ratification, and further complexity and can damage the effectiveness of international governance. Also, although states may sign a treaty obligating them to follow environmental regulations, the treaty may need to be passed into domestic law by a national by a national parliament, and its effectiveness depends on states' willingness to prosecute individuals or organisations who break the terms of the treaty. Nations can have many concerns of affecting international regime formation, for example. One US motive to participate in forming an Antarctic governance regime, which divided up by the Antarctic territory between states, was to have a location for United States military. Page 81, ladies and gents. Training in the extreme cold and one that was far away from the rival Soviet presence in the northern polar regions. The United States therefore sought to claim sovereignty over an area of the Antarctic for security and strategy reasons. Nations must also reconcile domestic interests as well as international ones. For example, the United States refused to sign the UN CLOS in a part to protest domestic business interest in deep seabed mining. It eventually signed the treaty in 1994 and recognized it as an aspect of international law. But the US Congress has not yet ratified the treaty. There is still political disagreement in the Congress over the effects the treaty would have on US sovereignty, security, and business interests. National interests relating to common resources can affect political, economic, and security concerns at a national level. Restricting or disputing access to the sea or airspace can quickly become a political and scrutiny threat for the states and regions, for example. From the 1960s and then until the 1990s, many African states banned apartheid South Africa from the use of airspace across Africa. This had immediate security and economic threats to South Africa, heavily reliant as it was on the European and the North American trade. The South American government negotiated its US allies to adapt Boeing 747 aircraft to fly long distance around South Africa and over the Atlantic Sea, I'm guessing. Over the Atlantic, South African Airways was also given permission from Portugal to build a one-way and terminal on the Portuguese colony Ile du Sal in the Atlantic to enable refueling stops on the route to Europe and the United States. A more recent example of a security threat is the existence of the piracy of the Somalian coast. The ocean surrounding the Horn of Africa contains major commercial shipping routes serving the Middle East, Asia and Europe via the Suez Canal. In the context of the Somalian civil war, which began in 1991, criminal gangs have attacked, robbed and hijacked shipping off the Somalian coast. The security threat had led to the international community responding to protect shipping and police the sea of the Horn of Africa. The response first came from a coalition of 25 nations, naval forces creating coalition 150 based in Bahrain, and then from the UN mandate, which deployed European Union and naval vessels in Operation Atlanta. Page 83 is a summary of the governments and the regimes. Managing common resources has done primarily through the negotiation and frame of international governance regimes. The governance regimes are set to rules and regulations that are not negotiated multilaterally between international partners and are enforceable via institution or clearly defined decision-making procedure. United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas (UNCLOS) is an example of a governance regime. Competing states' interests, both domestically and internationally, can lead to controversy and disagreement about the rights of access and exploitation of the common resources. The denial of access to common resources can quickly become security threats to states in economic, diplomatic, and military terms. Page 84. Next chapter. Common resources and state sovereignty. The, no- the notion of common resources in the contemporary world possesses challenges for the idea that the state are sovereign and that the international community can also act like a sovereign nation state. Where did the notion of sovereignty originate, and how was it changed in light of the need to form global governance regimes? In everyday language, the word sovereign means an individual or body that has supremacy, rank, or authority over others. In political terms, sovereignty originally developed in Europe to justify the attempt by monarchs to consolidate control over the kingdoms where authority and had originally been shared by the feudal aristocracy and the Catholic Church. The concept of sovereignty contributed to the formation of European states, particularly after the signing of the Peace Westphalia in 1648, following the 30 Years' War. The Westphalia negotiation established the principle of the autonomous and sovereign states in Europe that would not interfere with one another's domestic affairs. What became known as the Westphalian system developed into the dominant international governance system over the following centuries, promoting the principles of statehood and government at a state level. As European empires declined across the 20th century, the establishment of the UN in 1945 recognised newly independent sovereign the nation state and provided the international framework by which state could formulate, monitor and implement international rules. As part of this, the UN embedded the negotiation of the right to sovereignty across the exploitation of the sea between states. So you get a bit of a understanding about um, the WTO, the UN, and what Brexit all about now. It's all about the policy agreements. It's all about agreements, policies. I've got poxy freaking leaves get my nerves. Oh, better. Anyway, national sovereignty. There has been sort of a special care of property rights by concerning international agreements of trade, access to resource, regulated population, and so forth. Nations accept constraints on their absolute freedom of action. Signatory states agree in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, for example, to forego the traditional right of territorial acquisition by the discovery of occupation in exchange for peaceful access to the domain of outer space. Some international agreements impose restrictions on these activities that have traditionally been the rights of national governments, such as the right to use any weapons in wartime, the international ban on the use of landmines, for example, Some impose restrictions on the activities of people and corporations that are under national jurisdiction, such as the ban of manufacture and the use of chlorofluorocarbons (CFS). The emergence of international resource domains and the pollution of reveals how traditional concept of state sovereignty may no longer apply to tackling contemporary global challenges. Global pollution of the air and water relates to the plethora of the process and problems and can only be addressed if there is international cooperation agreement. The depletion of fish stocks and the use of the ozone destroying chemicals in industrialized states have seriously consequences for public health and economic prosperity worldwide. Nation states are choosing to cooperate in the formation of the new international governance regimes, which modify states' sovereign control over the effective resources and economic process. In this activity too, do you think is that international community has a duty collectively to regulate and restrict damaging environmental activities, as well as the right to access the global common resources, even if it undermines the concept of the state sovereignty? Or do you think that as a state, such as China and India, have sometimes argued states that do not have the right to develop their economies and have access to the resources in the region as they see fit? There is a there is no right or wrong answer to this debate. As you have read, there has been a strong argument that the international resources such as the high seas and global common resources have increasingly come under regulation during the 20th and 21st century, such as in the case of the atmosphere. These governance regimes inevitably reduce nation states' sovereignty in certain areas. However, one could argue that Western and Northern states, such as those in Europe and North America, have had centuries to exploit common resources and create regulations to their own benefit. In this line of argument, newly developing states such as India and China should also have the right to access resources in their region for their economic benefit. It's crazy, isn't it? Some of like fishing rights and all that sort of thing. It's a free country, free. I mean, free, not free country. It's a free world. You should be able to go and do what you please. Even without a visa and all that stuff. It's all rules and regulations. Summary: sovereignty means to have ultimate authority and control. The European nation and state system established the Treaty of Westphalia is premised on sovereign nation states. The international regulation of global common resource challenges, or or at least adapts the traditional nation of state sovereignty requiring states to defer in international regulations about common resource and change certain behaviours, such as those relating to environmental damage. Page 87, case study, hydropolitics in Central Asia. So far you've seen in broad terms, common resource refers to those resources that lie beyond the political reach of any one state and how regulating these common resources poses challenges to the notion of state sovereignty. But now you will consider a specific example where resources are shared between the territories of particularly nation states across particularly national borders. The following section explores the contested politics over such resources through the example of water and a trans-boundary resource in Central Asia. The politics of water. Following the end of the Cold War, concerns about security threats beyond traditional superpower rival the United States and the Soviet Union began to gain currency. And noted earlier, one of the key areas has started to concern academics and governments alike as they need for collective action to prevent incidents incidences of the tragedy of the commons. That is only important in terms of avoiding environmental catastrophe, but also had a potentially powerful impact on relation between the states. Water can often be considered as a regional and global common resource. It is a shared resource that crosses national boundaries and whose use whose use is contested. Water particularly important because access to it is considered a basic human rights. Consequently, water is a resource that has the potential for both cooperation and conflict. Perhaps the, the two key features of international domain in which states interact. Interaction between states over water can range from disputes over contested maritime boundaries and access to transboundary water resources such as rivers flowing from one state to another, to cooperation between states on managing water courses and preventing environmental problems. The term hydropolitics is used in policies and international study to describe this dynamic. As you will see in the following case study, changes in domestic and international politics can also have a major effect on the politics of water. For example, when new states come into being and are faced to competing claims and the desires to assert themselves as sovereign entities. The management of water resources has become a concern for governments across the world, particularly in areas where s- scarcity of the water is becoming an issue. In the early 1990s, scholars argued that the water was likely to become a source of conflict in the coming years. Gleek 1993, Homer Dixon of 1994. Others, however, rejected the notion of water's wars as something of a myth. For example, Wolf 1998 observed that, with the exception of a few minor skirmishes, a war has never been fought over water as yet. The potential of conflict does, however, become more acute when water resources crosses borders. This is particularly true for rivers that are source of energy, irrigation and drinking water for a state or states. These competing uses create a dynamic or of dependence between the upstream and downstream states. In terms of control over the resource, if the upstream state controls the headwaters of a particular river and neighbouring downstream state requires, then it potentially holds a considerable amount of power over them. Situations such as this are often referred to as zero-sum games. One party's gain is gains. They sum to zero. Put simply, one state gain is achieved for the other state losing, and the potential for conflict is clear. However, the view is contested by some who highlight the historical cooperation between states on such issues. As noted earlier, there have been no major conflicts over the water thus far, and international organisations have been set up to promote cooperation over water resources through the United Nations Convention on the Protection and the Use of Transboundary Watercourse at international lakes. In the case of Central Asia, water politics have become an increasingly pressing issue since the states of the region gained independence. From the breakup, Following the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, you'll see how the spectra of conflict and potential for cooperation loom large over the international relations of the region in relation to water, and you explore how these relate to the notion of sovereignty that you was introduced to earlier. Hydropolitics in Central Asia. The Soviet Union was formed, formally discovered in hydropolitics. You know what they're saying there? They're talking about the treaties over water. The Soviet Union formally dissolved in 31st December 1991. This was a major event in international history, ending the Cold War and changing the nature of global politics. But it was also the beginning of a new era. For example, living in constituent republics as they become newly independent states, which this independence came a whole set of conflicting issues as the former Soviet republics grapple with the realities of becoming sovereign entities no longer controlled by Moscow. The newly independent states inherited the, the remnants of the central planned economy that has served the interests of the Soviet Union. As a result, who, whole swathes of the new states' infrastructures were integrated. with one another. From the oil and natural gases pipelines one in the Caspian Sea, the Russian heartland, to the management of the water resources and irrigation systems. These now cross international borders rather than lying within the one unified state. Difficulties that the republics encountered in establishing themselves and independent sovereign states were further complicated by slimming ethnic tensions, which had in turn been exacerbated by the arbitrary drawing of the individual republic's border during the early years of the Soviet Union. These problems are well illustrated as Central Asia, which became home to five independent states: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. This will show political borders of newly independent states that were inherited from the Soviet Union. It also highlights the main ethnic groups found in the region. So you can see the complexities and the play here. While the Soviet Union's drawing of borders in Central Asia was broadly carried out along patterns of the ethnic settlement and linguistics, it failed to take account into the region's complex ethnic geography. As an example, primary Tajik majority cities of the Burkira and Samarkand were incorporated into the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic (SSR), and the predominantly Uzbek city of Osh became part of the Kyrgyz SSR. This exercise also imposed the idea of nationality among the peoples of the region, which had previously not been the main self-identifying factor in Central Asia. It arguably represents a classical in order to manage it to prevent it from unfilling the challenge its rule. These boundary lines become the international borders of sovereign states in 1991. Looking at, you can see Kazakhstan and what's around. It's just off Russia, in between. It's in Asia Island, Kazakhstan. That's what we're just talking about. Hello, Kevin. How are you doing there, sir? The water problem. You may wonder what it's all about to do with water, Central Asia. Talk about hydropolitics. Talk about the waters governed governed by the lands. What lands and the waters? The constituency the waters are surrounding. But what gives them the right to own them waters? The water problem. You may wonder what all this has to do with water. Central Asia was at the heart of the Soviet cotton growing industry and water intensive industry that remains vitally important to the region today, particularly in Uzbekistan. During the Soviet era, a huge irrigation network was built to serve the cotton industry. The diversion of water from the region's two main rivers, the Amu Dairi and the Siri Daira, throughout the 1990s and 1970s led to one of the most significant environmental tragedies in recent times. The desiccation of the Aral Sea, which lies on the border of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. One of the world's fourth largest lake by 1991, the Aral Sea had shrunk to half its surface area, and the shrinkage continues in the most recent measurements, estimating the sea to be around 10% of its original size. The, desi- the, the desiccation has caused major health problems in the area, with now exposed seabed covered in the salt and toxic chemicals that are carried into the surrounding population. While the water usage related to cotton monoculture in the region remained a domestic issue until 1991, the subsequent emergence of independent states in the region meant that each new country sought to establish sovereignty over its resources. This meant that the water became an international issue. As the headwaters of the region's two main rivers were now located in separate states from the ones that relied on heavily on them for their agriculture needs. 90% of the region's water resources are located in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, over half of 52% of region's entire water. I'm very well, Jennifer. I hope you're well too, my dear. As a result of cotton's industry, further complicating the picture, another major legacy of the Soviet era in Central Asia was the creation of electricity water nexus, whereby the generation of electricity for the hydropower of the upstream countries was linked to the water needs of those downstream. Under the Soviet regime, huge reservoirs were constructed in upstream Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to avoid cotton production downstream, primarily in Uzbekistan. With the water flows managed centrally from Moscow, hydropower stations were also built and incorporated into the region's energy grids so that the power generated could be distributed across the region. Coal and gas were generated could be distributed across the region. Coal and gas were supplied by Uzbekistan to upstream republics that lacked fossil fuel resources, again, all centrally managed by Moscow. However, on independence, this created a major issue as the states were locked into an independence that clashed with their desires to protect their sovereign resources as independent states. Consequently, the upstream states of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan view their water and control over it as a commodity, but are now subject to fuel deliveries and reliant on energy of Uzbekistan owing to the Soviet era energy infrastructure with which they were left. These resources have become bargaining chips for their respective countries and now play a key role in relations between them. Since independence, there have been irregular diplomatic clashes among states. Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan were among the protests of the Soviet republics, but now have control of the water required by Uzbekistan for its cotton and agriculture industry. They also want to develop their considerable hydropower potential, as they lack fossil fuels that overpower generation. I mean, you see, you got the oil rigs out at sea, haven't we? Over in certain parts of the sea, you need oil to keep your you got oil in a lot of your petrol as well, haven't you, nowadays? If they hold back water, it is a detrimental effect on downstream Uzbekistan. If they release a large volume through the dams to generate power, then this can also cause severe flooding downstream. Both scenarios have damaging impact of Uzbekistan cotton industry. In relation, Uzbekistan had periodically seized its gas supplies to Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and closed its borders. The closing of borders is especially problematic as the transport infrastructure inherited from the Soviet era cut across what are now international boundaries. Uzbekistan is also the most populous state in the region, is the main military power and threatened force against its neighbours if water is used as a weapon against it. I mean, through previous study, I mean, Africa always going to war with Nigeria. Why is that? I mean, Russia's big for oil, isn't it? What do you think Nigeria is also big for? Oil. Really big country for oil. Nigeria's. And that's why Africa always trying to get across their borders. Complex borders. The potential for further exacerbation of the such tensions can be seen when focusing on the era where the borders of Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan meet. The Ferghani Valley. This has long been one of the most populous areas of Central Asia and has traditionally served as its agriculture heartland. The drawing of borders between then the Soviet republics during the 1920s left the valley crisis crossed by the complex web of borders, including several en- enclaves whereby one territory is completely surrounded by another. During the Soviet times, these borders were merely administrative, with little in the way of actual demarcation, Which borders are physically defined, they had little impact of daily life. Following independence, they become international borders, but remain poorly demarcated, particularly in the mountains surrounding the Fergana Valley. The complex political geography and difficult topography is illustrated in figure 3.7 with the national borders marked in the red. Note the presence of the large Toggle and the Karakum reservoirs in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan respectively and lower at altitude of the valley in the centre of the map. Largely located inside Uzbek territory and the home of the region's cotton industry. But I've got 5 more minutes reading, guys, and if you want to have a general chat about anything, debate, or just general chat, how you getting on, as your father, as your family, we can. Come up to the last 5 minutes, 4 minutes. Water disputes can also take an ethnic dimension in the region, with minority groups such as a large Uzbek population in the Kyrgyz city of Osh. Often live in the border areas, disputes among local communities over the water here can quickly escalate because of mobilization. Mo- mobilization among community networks rooted in ethnic solidarity because each state contains significant minorities that have close ties to communities in neighbouring states. Such as communities are often treated with suspicion. There have been campaigns for greater cultural and linguistic rights among the large Tajik minority living in Uzbekistan, and the scientific Uzbek population living in the Osh region of Kyrgyzstan has also periodically risen up against preserved discrimination. The Fergana Valley has traditionally been a religiously conservative area and has at times chafed against the secular governments of the region. The valley has often been targeted because of Uzbekistan's government perceiving it as being home to the Al-Qaeda affiliated Islamic movement of Uzbekistan (IMU), who also fought alongside the Taliban in Afghanistan and have carried out sporadic attacks across the region. This is particularly incurred in the wrath of Islam Karimov, president of Uzbekistan since the independence in 1991, under the pretext of the US-led war on terror. Karimov campaigned to rid the region of Islamic extremists, thus further inflaming tensions. As a result, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan have, in addition to their clashes over water, accused each other for harbouring terrorists or of not doing enough to tackle the problem. The wider regional picture must also be considered. The region is susceptible to instability spilling over from Afghanistan. As the actions that IMU demonstrate, Central Asia has also seen an influx of Chinese and Western investment in the considerable oil and natural gas resources in the Caspian Basin, which forms the southwest border of Kazakhstan, as well as more assertive Russian presence in a region it considers as its own near abroad. Therefore, outside forces have the further influence on the regions of international relations. Conflict or cooperation. It is clear that their situation in Central Asia is complex and has the potential for conflict. The water issue, along with the other problems, such as a lack of development over reliance on cotton and the spectre of terrorism, has led to the region becoming highly securitized. This means that such issues are helped up vital each state as national security. How might such problems lead to conflicts between the states in Central Asia? What are potential triggers for conflict there? How do water issues exacerbate other existing tensions? There are numbers of potential triggers to conflict in the region. Therefore, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan were to uphold water supplies downstream Uzbekistan. This would deprive the latter of the basic right in having access to water and seriously damage its economy in Uzbekistan could retaliate by withholding gas supplies to the two states, which could have a major impact on their populations during the severe winters experienced there. This could have a knock-on effect and exacerbate inter-ethnic relations within each state owning to the regions. The complex borders of ethnic mix. One state feel might be obliged to step and support in its ethnic kin in a neighbouring state if their rights are not being fully respected. That's the part. That's the reading finished, ladies and gents. Who's still here? Jen, you still here? Calvin, thank you all, guys, for giving me some encouragement. I'm doing this day in day out. I get through my module, my academic year. I read. What I do is I read I read 100 pages. I've got another 5 pages to go. I do 100 pages, and then I go back from the start and I write notes. I write notes. Hydropolitics. Hydropolitics that we've been talking about. All for that hour. Hydropolitics. Hydropolitics. Talk about, the absolute sovereignty owning of the waters. Who owns the waters around that constituency of the land? How much water do you own before you're into Spain's water? How much water does Spain own before they're in the North Sea? That's what you got to think about. And why? Why? Why can't I go fishing in Spain's water? It's all about visas and whatever. Them taking over their own rights over their own waters. That's why we have all these wars over the years. We had battle more. I don't think that's over fishermen's rights. Maybe look into it. Could well have been. I can't remember now. I read it a little while ago. Read it a little while ago. A few months ago. 4 months ago. 3 months ago. Anyway, ladies and gents, thank you all for listening. Take care. One love. Speak soon.